Today we're talking about Japan versus China, and again, I'm going to be weaving in and out of some history, some of which you have heard before, and the bits and pieces of things, because since I'm talking about the history of Japan, I have to repeat certain things. I can't make up all new facts about that. So we'll get into some of those details. And after today, we will have one more lecture tomorrow afternoon, and that will be on the Pacific War. And I will deal with how the war started, but then some key turning points in the Pacific War. And then the end, we've already sort of dealt with in my first lecture about the birth of the atomic age, but we'll get into that tomorrow. I start with something I've already talked about, and that is the Meiji Emperor. The Meiji Emperor and his family are pictured here. This is from the 1880s. The Meiji Emperor's dynasty was called Meiji, which means enlightened peace. Every imperial dynasty has a name that they choose for that dynasty. It's rather ironic that the Meiji Emperor means enlightened peace, because 1866 to 68, which was the restoration, when the emperor was really given authority again after the shoguns had been running things for 700 years or so. This started a century of warfare, of military expansionism and imperialism, which of course brought the whole world to a point of violence and war. So we'll talk about that. Again, in 1603, the Tokugawa shogun had taken over as the military ruler. He was the third in dynastic shoguns, and after 220 years, most of it a period of isolation, called the Sakoru period, where Japan was cut off from the rest of the world. No one was allowed to visit Japan. The only place, there was one small island in Nagasaki where they traded with Dutch and Portuguese, but no other interaction with the outside world, and no Japanese commoners were allowed to leave Japan. Well, in 1853, when Commodore Matthew Perry came to Japan with his gunships, Japan saw how far behind they were militarily and technologically to the rest of the world after over 200 years of isolation. And the decision was made by the Meiji Emperor in the mid-1860s. Between 1866 and 68, they fought a war. Two of the major daimyos, or clan lords, Satsuma and Chosun, decided to rebel against the shogun, the Tokugawa shogun. They drove him from power, and they reestablished the authority of the emperor rather than the emperor just being a figurehead. So this was the Meiji Restoration, and the Meiji Emperor immediately realized, having seen what the American gunships were capable of doing, immediately decided that Japan had to aggressively begin to modernize, to upgrade their military, to begin to be a manufacturing. And his goal, his simple stated goal, was that he wanted Japan to be a competitor equal to any of the Western powers, which would have been absurd to anyone else in those days. And yet, through the 44-year period of the Meiji era up until 1912, Japan did a phenomenal job of growing into not just from being an agrarian to being a manufacturing, a highly industrialized nation. But as I've said several times, the problem for Japan was, in order to become an industrialized nation, in order to be able to develop the kinds of military capabilities and manufacturing that they wanted, they were very limited in resources. They had very little iron just on the southern parts of the islands. They had no coal and no oil, all things that were desperately needed if they were going to modernize. So Japan starts looking around, and they realize that they're going to have to get those resources from somewhere else. The first thing they did was to look right across the very narrow Tsushima Straits to Korea. Korea has all of those things. And so Japan immediately started considering Korea. They traded with them at first, but Japan realized, looking at the Western powers, looking at the United States, we had forced Japan to open their doors to us for trading because of, by using gunships. This is gunship diplomacy, it used to be called. But the British, the French, the Germans, the Russians, all of them, if they needed some resources from a smaller, weaker country, they would just take it. And so Japan said, well, if they can do that, why can't we? And so they began to look first at Korea, right across the straits, but then this northeastern area of China, Manchuria, was full of the kind of resources they wanted. Japan watched Great Britain twice in the 19th century defeat China humiliatingly in the two opium wars, both of which were fought in order to force China to import opium from India, which was a part of the British Empire, in order to offset the cost that the British had for the tea that they wanted to get from China. So the Chinese were defeated twice by Britain, forced to import opium, which at one point, I haven't done that talk in this tour, I've got a talk called Opium Wars and the Boxer Rebellion. It was estimated that 90% of the young adult males along the east coast, which is the heavily populated area of China, were addicted to opium. It was a quite serious problem, and yet Britain fought wars to force the Chinese to import opium to offset the cost of the tea that they were wanting to purchase. So Japan had seen that. They had seen China humiliated in that way. And then in 1899 to 1901, there was the Boxer Rebellion, in which there was a major rebellion to try to throw Westerners out of China. 8 different countries sent in military forces, small forces, but together they defeated the Boxer Rebellion, and once again, China was humiliated. Russia and Japan especially noted this. Quite a few different properties in China got then just deeded over to other countries. This is the Opium Wars, was how Britain ended up controlling Hong Kong and Kowloon, the coastal area around the island of Hong Kong. Various other nationalities took over major port cities. I think it was you all, I mentioned Qingdao, the city in China that is known for the beer, Qingdao beer. It was Germany was given that port. It was Germans that built that brewery. The #1 beer in China now was first brewed by Germans who were living in Qingdao. If you go there now, half the city is still called the German half of the city, and it looks like German architecture. So that was the kind of problems that China was having, not being able to control their own destiny. Japan saw this, and so they said, we need to take some actions to get the resources we needed. China, even though they were not as powerful as they once had been, they still had major control over Korea. Korea was an independent state, but they really were dancing to China's tune, and China saw them as a primarily tributary state. Japan started sending in their own ambassadors and others into China, and it came to be a competition between Korea, excuse me. It became a competition between China and Japan to influence the government and the public in Korea. And China and Japan had conflicts back and forth about all of this. China had not been successful as Japan had been to modernize their military and their industrial capability. And so Japan began to get the edge over China. Various legations from China and from Japan were in Korea, and again there would be disagreements and spats. At one point, some of the pro-China population in Korea rebelled against the Japanese presence, and these images are from that period of time in which they forced the legation, the ambassadors and military advisors of the Japanese, to flee the country in a fishing boat. They killed one military advisor, and so Korea later on was forced by Japan to pay compensation for that, and also in 1875 and 76, Japan forced Korea to open their ports to trade with Japan and with other countries. So this conflict back and forth between Japan and China over the control of Korea and the resources in Korea eventually led to such a conflict that Japan and China had to sign a treaty called the Lee-Ito Convention, where they both said, we'll take our troops out, we will not send troops back into Korea unless we get permission from the other side. That the Koreans and the Japanese had to agree before either side would have military presence in Korea anymore. Well, in 1894, Korea was suffering under a rebellion called the Tonga Rebellion, and it was really frightening the government, the king and government of Korea, and so without really thinking about the consequences, they invited China to come back into Korea with troops to help them put down this rebellion. Well, Japan considered that a violation of their treaty with China because they didn't ask Japan before Chinese troops went in. So the Japanese sent their troops back into Korea. And you've got Chinese and Japanese troops again, and eventually they declared war against one another, Japan and China, on August 1st of 1894. No one expected Japan to win this war because the rest of the world had not been paying attention to how much Japan had modernized over the last 40 years or so. And so when they actually went to war, everyone thought China's always been the power in this region. They have a much larger army. They are going to just, step on Japan and it'll all be over with. But in fact, what happened was, and I've got this up here, this is a modern picture, but I did it because it's easier to see. This little thumb that sticks down here into the Bohai Sea and the Yellow Sea is called the Liaotung Peninsula. And it was critically important because it provided there were ports there. It's a warm water port. Russia, and I'm going to talk about the importance of this in a minute, Russia's only port on the Pacific, the southern part of Russia, was Vladivostok. That was as far south as they could go with a port. So the whole Russian Pacific fleet was based out of Vladivostok. The problem is Vladivostok freezes up in the wintertime and nobody goes in or out. And so the Russians, and I'll get to this in a minute, they really wanted to have a port somewhere down here that did not freeze in the wintertime so that they could base their Pacific fleet out of that. Well, when the war was declared between Japan and China, Japan invaded through Korea, marched up through Korea, as defeating the military resistance by the Chinese. They come up to the top of the Liaotung Peninsula and then march back down. They take over the port of Port Arthur. They cross over to Waihai and they take over Taiwan as well. In 6 months, the Chinese are defeated by the Japanese military, and everyone is stunned by that. It's very simply, it happened because Japan was a modern army for the end of the 19th century. You can sort of see the difference here. This is the Japanese, images of the Japanese attacking Chinese in a fortified wall. These are Japanese soldiers, and their uniforms look like modern, late 19th century Western uniforms. This is what the Chinese were still dressed like. The Japanese had purchased the very finest military weaponry. They had battleships from France. They had guns from various other Western powers. And for the most part, the Chinese, as large as their army was still fighting primarily with swords and bows. And so in 6 months, the Chinese are defeated by the Japanese. This is an image that came out at that time, that little Japan is standing on the chest of the giant China. And so it's very clear from images of that period that the difference between the two purely had to do with Japan's success in modernizing and not relying on the old traditional either weaponry or the approach to warfare. So China, now, in the 19th century, was defeated twice by the British in the Opium Wars. They were defeated by a group of military powers, 8 different countries that came in for the Boxer Rebellion, and now they're defeated by Japan. The complete collapse of Imperial China then happened in 1911. That multi-thousand-year history of China ended. The Emperor Puyi stepped down, and they became the Republic of China. We'll talk about the conflict that they had in a little bit. Korea at that point was completely independent from China after the victory of the Japanese in the First Sino-Japanese War. And so Japan sort of took over control of Korea. Technically at first, it was still an independent country. In 1910, they actually annexed all of Korea. It became part of the Japanese Empire. And from that point on, as I talked about when I did the talk about Korea, the Japanese more and more made efforts to try to wipe away Korean culture and to turn it into part of Japan. They forced the teaching of Japanese history. Eventually, they forbade the speaking of Korean. They forced Koreans to attend Shinto shrines, which is the folk religion of Japan. So they did everything they could to try to convert Korea into another arm of the Japanese Empire. As I mentioned before, sociologists have said had it not been for the defeat of the Japanese in 1945, it's very possible that the Korean culture and language would have been wiped out, that it would have been completely gone. But of course, that didn't happen, fortunately. So when little Japan defeats giant China, most of the Western powers still didn't quite get that Japan had achieved a parity in terms of military power with many of the other Western nations. And Russia, remember, needed a warm water port. They needed a port for the Pacific Fleet that didn't freeze in the wintertime. So even though, and I'll go back to this, even though the victory over China meant that the Japanese were given Taiwan, the Pescadores Islands, they were also given control of this Liaotung Peninsula by the Chinese. Well, Russia had their own intentions and desires for all of that, and so Russia got France and Germany to back them up in going to the Japanese and saying, you should not, and in fact cannot go into the Liaotung Peninsula, into Manchuria, that province of China, because the Russians had their own desire. Well, Japan was feeling their oats having defeated China, but they still weren't ready to fight three major Western powers, Russia, Germany, and France, and so they backed off. Well, Russia, very short time after that, leased the Liaotung Peninsula for 25 years from China and started building their own port. Port Arthur, it was called. Today it's known as the port of town of Lushan. And they began to use that as the base for their Pacific Fleet. And it really irritated the Japanese because they had fought a war and won the rights to that, and then the Russians sort of intimidated them out of it. Despite every effort at that point by Japan to try to negotiate with the Russians, in addition to taking over the Liaotung Peninsula, the Russians insisted that they control the northern part of the Korean Peninsula down to the 39th parallel. They said that was a buffer zone for them. And so the Japanese were not able to take over complete control of Korea. They didn't have any presence in Manchuria, the Liaotung Peninsula, all of which they supposedly had won in a war. They kept trying to get Russia to negotiate with them, and they were prepared to say, we will give you Manchuria if you let us have control of Korea. Tsar Nicholas II figured he could just tell the Japanese what to do, and if they didn't listen to him, he would simply step on their neck. You know, he could do whatever he wanted to. He referred to the Japanese as those little yellow monkeys at one point, and the other people in the Russian nobility and the military considered the Japanese to be unworthy to even talk to. This is some of the propaganda images that were popular in Russia as it looked as though Japan was threatening war, and as it looked as though they might come to blows. You've got, a Cossack whipping a Japanese sailor, punching one in the nose. You've got a Cossack picking up a Japanese military soldier and shaking him or looking at them like they were little dogs. This is how the Russians felt about the noise that Japan was making. Well, later on, they were sorry that they felt that way because in 1902, Japan signed a mutual defense treaty with Great Britain, which said that if any other country, like France or Germany, came in with Russia, Great Britain would defend Japan, and that kept everybody else out of it. So now it was only between Japan and Russia if there was going to be any conflict. And so on February 8th of 1904, Japan was successful in having a surprise attack on the port of Port Arthur. Sound familiar? Surprise attack on a naval base. The Japanese attacked Port Arthur, the Russian Navy, using primarily mini-subs and torpedo boats, and they were successful in seriously damaging a number of battleships. They then withdrew outside the bay of Port Arthur and mined the area just outside the harbor, and then they had their own naval ships. And again, they had some very advanced naval weaponry, although Russia had probably the biggest navy in the world at this point. So the Russians at one point tried to break out, and because of the mining of the area just outside the harbor, one of their other battleships was sunk and another one was seriously damaged, and the senior officer at Port Arthur, who was an admiral, was killed in that. So we had a standoff. The Russians couldn't get out of their port, and the Japanese couldn't get into the port, primarily because on the ring of hills above Port Arthur, there were gun emplacements. And so the Russians had guns that they could fire down on the Japanese if they tried to come into the port, and it was a standoff. So, being very determined, the Japanese, again, travel all the way up through Korea, much of which they already control by this point, up into Manchuria, and then approached Port Arthur down the Liaotung Peninsula from the back, winning all of these sort of star shapes or battles. The Japanese won virtually every battle because, again, the Russians did not give them any credit. And so they refused to recognize that they were fighting a legitimate enemy, and so they kept getting beat. The Japanese, however, lost 500,000 casualties in this campaign. And that was important because later on they felt they had a right to Manchuria because they had lost so much blood trying to win it back from the Russians. Well, the Japanese come down behind Port Arthur. They end up, very bloody campaign, they end up taking the gun emplacements above the harbor, and once they controlled those, they could fire down on the Russian ships. They completely destroyed the Russian fleet. And the Russian fleet, once it was gone, the commanding officer, who was Major General Anatoly Stessel, the Russian army general, the naval admiral who had been in charge before, was killed. The general, with the fleet gone, surrendered Port Arthur to the Japanese. I mean, they had destroyed, with the guns above the port, they had destroyed 4 more battleships. They forced a 5th one to be scuttled, 2 cruisers, and on and on. They destroyed the fleet. And so the Russians surrendered, much to the chagrin of Tsar Nicholas. He was unbelieving. He was, as my Canadian friends would say, gobsmacked that the Japanese would have done a surprise attack on Port Arthur. He didn't think they were capable of it. And in fact, when it happened, the Russians complained, wait a minute, you attacked a surprise attack. You didn't declare war. And they reminded Russia that in 1808, they had attacked Sweden without declaring war. So tit for tat. Besides, it wasn't until 3 years later in 1907 that it became part of the international conventions that you should declare war before you attack somebody. So the Japanese ended up winning that battle. Well, Tsar Nicholas was not prepared to accept this. Apparently, he was practically comatose over the shock of all of this, because all of the advisors had said, no, the Japanese are not going to bother us. So, since the Pacific Fleet out of Vladivostok up here had been destroyed, Tsar Nicholas decided to send a whole other fleet to deal with this problem. He had a fleet in the Black Sea, but they were kind of restricted from entering the Mediterranean, so he sent his Baltic fleet from up here in the Baltic Sea. They traveled all the way around Africa. The British were not going to let them use the Suez Canal, so they were forced to go all the way around Africa, literally halfway around the world. That's the blue line. Took them 7 months. And Tsar Nicholas said, you just wait, Japanese, till my Baltic fleet gets there, and they'll show you what for. So the Baltic fleet, the Japanese had great intelligence, and they knew exactly where the Baltic fleet was the whole time. When they get up here to the Tsushima Straits between Korea and Japan, and they start sailing through in line, the Japanese were waiting for them. And they did what in naval tactical command is called cross the T, which meant the Russian boats were all in a line, and that means only the front ship could really fire at the enemy. Well, they had their ships in a T across that, which meant all of their ships could fire at the Russians. They sank the second Russian fleet. Completely destroyed it. So 2 of Russia's 3 fleets are now gone. They are no longer a major naval power because of the Japanese. Tsar Nicholas is beside himself, as you can imagine, and at that point, Teddy Roosevelt, the President of the United States, stepped in and offered to negotiate or moderate a peace treaty between the 2, which Tsar Nicholas was very quick to let some other Western power sort of come in and kind of try to resolve this issue to try to save as much face as possible. Unfortunately, as far as the Japanese were concerned, Teddy Roosevelt was not neutral. He really, for instance, those are the days when if you won a war, you expected to receive reparations. You would receive some financial payment or give property or something else if you were the victor. Well, Teddy Roosevelt insisted that the Russians did not have to pay any reparations to the Japanese, and the Japanese were very frustrated by that. The only thing they ended up getting from it was that they took over all of the Korean Peninsula, and later on, of course, in 1910, they annexed the whole thing as part of Japan, and they took over part of Manchuria, where the Russians had been. But this really planted seeds for a lot of future history. In fact, the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905 is considered the most important war that nobody remembers anymore. Because just 10 years later, because of all of this, and also because of involvement in the First World War, the Russian Empire fell. And of course, the Soviet Revolution, the Russian Revolution came in, and then eventually the Soviet Union was formed. And this really was a direct contributor, a major contributor to that. But in addition, the feelings that they had around all of this greatly affected the first two world wars. Because in the First War, Russia had thought that Germany had been assisting Japan. And so that increased the likelihood of Russia, which they did, fighting against Germany in the First World War. And then in the Second World War, because Japan felt like the United States and Russia had been against them in the negotiations after this war, they were much more quick to side with the Germans, who were the enemies of, at first, and then later Russia and certainly the United States. So these two world wars were greatly affected by this, but it did contribute a great deal to the confidence of Japan. They have now defeated China, they have now defeated Russia, and so the idea that they really could be successful in taking the resources they wanted really impressed them. Now, one of the things that the Russians had done when they were controlling this area, the Litung Peninsula and north of that, again, the Soviet Union, what was Russia here, and this was Manchuria. Well, the Japanese took over where the Russians had left. The Russians had built part of a Manchurian railway. The Japanese took it over and they extended it, and they created the South Manchurian Railway Corporation. The South Manchurian Railway Corporation not only was railroads, but they ended up getting involved in mining and ports and a lot of other things. And in just a few years, the South Manchurian Railway Corporation, entirely Japanese owned, became the largest corporation in all of Asia. And the Japanese were bringing in Japanese immigrants as managers. They were the white-collar workers. The blue-collar workers in all of their various efforts were entirely either Korean or Chinese. So some of that led to this sort of distinction, this idea that the Japanese were superior in terms of their management abilities. Well, after a number of years, we're pushing up now until 1931, and they've been growing the economy in Manchuria, they've been growing their investments there. The Japanese get tired of doing all of this work and being so successful, and it's still being somebody else's country. And so in 1931, in September, they created an incident called the Mukden Incident, or sometimes the Manchurian Incident, in which they set off some explosives near to the railway line. Now, we even know the name of the guy who was a lieutenant in the Imperial Japanese Army who set off the explosions. And it didn't do any damage to the track. The train came through just a few minutes later. It was fine. But the Japanese claimed that this was an example that there were insurgents in the area in Manchuria that were trying to destroy Japanese interests, and that justified sending in their army. They sent in their army, and then they, shortly thereafter, 6 months later, they declared that this whole area was no longer Chinese Manchuria. It was now a new state, a new country, which was a puppet regime of Japan called Manchukuo. Well, Manchukuo, interestingly, because it was Manchuria, the last emperor of China had been Puyi. If you've seen the movie The Last Emperor, Puyi, in fact, the whole last dynasty, the Qing dynasty, had been Manchurian. Well, in order to sort of try to give this a thin varnish of credibility or respectability, they went and got Puyi and made him the emperor of Manchukuo. But he entirely was under the control of the Japanese at this point. The next year, in 1932, the League of Nations sent in a commission called the Lytton Commission, and they studied this. They came back and generated a report that said the whole thing was a fraud. The Japanese had concocted this idea in order to justify taking over Manchuria and creating a puppet country, and therefore they should get out. So the League of Nations insisted that Japan withdraw. The next year, Japan responded by leaving the League of Nations. So there was no longer any formal connection between them and other countries. At that point, various Western powers, including the United States, began to embargo the Japanese, cut off the supply of oil and other raw materials that they needed. as a way to try to force them out of China. Well, the Japanese responded by instead digging their heels in. And they believed that this was a matter of survival for them as a nation. That without those resources, and they had only done, they felt like what every other country had done, and that is taken what they thought they needed, and the West had been doing that for a long, long time. Then this was really the time for the rise of imperialism, of militarism in Japan. It especially was impacted by the Great Depression. We sometimes forget that the Great Depression, 1930s, affected the whole planet. Everybody was affected by this. It was not just an American phenomenon, the Great Depression. Japan was impacted in terms of their ability to continue to trade. So between the embargoes and the Great Depression, they felt they had to take some action to guarantee the availability of resources, since they were being cut off by the Western powers' embargoes and various other limitations. So in July 1937, they created another incident called the Marco Polo Bridge Incident, which led to them declaring war against China for a second time. In 1937, after the U.S. had frozen Japan's assets and embargoed their oil, and Japan felt they had to do something to survive, they declared war against China with the intention, the long-term plan, to be able to access some of the resources, not only in China, but then south of China, down into the Dutch East Indies had oil, for instance, down south, in various other areas. So you get Manchukuo, which was the purple area here, was entirely, and as you can see, Korea, was entirely part of the Japanese Empire at that point. They declare war and begin to take over some of the major cities, Peking, what we know as Beijing today, as well as almost every port city, all the way down around the coast. They controlled all of the ports, many of the major cities here. Later on, they would begin to take over Burma, Thailand, French Indochina, British Malaya, the Dutch East Indies down here, later on in the war. But this war, which 1937 is when they declared war against the Chinese. The Chinese today still refer to this as the 14-year war because they feel it really started in 1931 and didn't end until 1945 when the Japanese were defeated in the Second World War. So this is where they feel 1931 was where the aggression by the Japanese against China began, and these are propaganda posters for Japan and for China as part of that war, the Second Sino-Japanese War. The majority of casualties in the Pacific theater of the Second World War were in China. We often don't think about that, but this is where the Second World War really began. Eventually, this Japanese and Chinese war developed into what was called the India-Burma-China theater of war, and because they ended up controlling most of that. There were efforts to try to get materials across the Himalayas, since the various ports were all closed down to fly the hump, as it was called. The Allies were flying materials over the southern Himalayas in order to try to get materials in so the Chinese could continue to fight against the Japanese as that part of the war. So 1937 to 39 was this rapid expansion in this area of the world, in China and the surrounding countries. 1939 to 43 in this area was pretty much a period of stalemate. The Japanese could control all the cities, but they did not have the resources to take over all the countryside. And so the war continued in sort of a stalemate. And then 1944 and 45, of course, there was a major Allied counterattack, both from the Pacific and through this area on land. This is what it looked like in 1940. As the Japanese had begun to take over more and more, and you see they were reaching down, they controlled the ports here, controlling more and more China, and then later on they would take over Burma, Indochina, etc., to try to cut off China from any of those resources. The Japanese were quite aggressive against the Chinese cities. The city of Nanking, or Nanjing, it's sometimes called, the names have changed, was the capital city of the Republic of China at that point. Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist Party were the official party of China. They were involved in the Civil War that I'll talk about in just a minute here. But the rape of Nanking, as it is often referred to, is one example of the kind of horrific things that the Chinese people suffered. In this, and there are disagreements about the numbers. There are even some people who claim that it was not, that it didn't really happen this way, but virtually all historians, legitimate historians, agree that this really happened. Somewhere upwards, or as much as 30,000 civilians were killed in Nanking. Up to 80,000 women were raped, almost all of them killed afterwards, and there's a lot of photographic evidence of this kind of stuff. The Japanese, during this time in the China campaign, they issued an order called the 3 Alls. That was kill all, loot all, burn all. That order, which was an official order from the Japanese military, which was controlling, the military was the entire government of, by this time, of Japan. It's believed that that one order, the 3 Alls order, resulted in the death of 2.7 million people. A third of the city was leveled, the buildings were destroyed, and again, Japan controlled almost all of the Chinese cities in the east and north, but they were not able to control the countryside. Then on September 7th of 1941, of course, the Japanese army was primarily concerned with the Chinese and the Russians on the land battles. The Imperial Japanese Navy was concerned about the naval forces that could oppose them, which almost entirely meant the United States Navy. And that's why on December 7th of 1941, in an effort to knock out the only naval force that they thought could really challenge them in the Pacific, they attacked Pearl Harbor early morning on a Sunday. But again, as I've said before, a lot of people don't realize that within 7 hours of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese also attacked Singapore, Hong Kong, Burma, which were the 3 primary British properties in this part of the world, and then also Guam, Wake Island, and the Philippines, 3 other areas that were controlled by the United States at that point. So on that one day, December 7th, the Japanese had a comprehensive plan to try to attack all of the strong points of the British and the Americans in order to try to make sure that they could be successful both on land and at sea. During that same period of time, of course, there were other things going on in China. The Chinese Civil War had begun in 1930 between the Nationalist Party under Chiang Kai-shek, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. The Nationalist Party, or the Kuomintang, as it was called in China, had taken over the government sometime before and were the official government of China at that point, but they were in conflict with the Communist Party of China under Mao Zedong. They began in 1930. They fought an active civil war until 1937. Between 1937 and 1945, they actually declared a united front, a truce, because they recognized their biggest enemy was Japan. And they fought against Japan from 37 to 45, and then in 1945 through 49, after the Japanese were defeated, they began the Civil War again. This gives you an idea. The blue areas here were controlled by the dark blue areas, rather, by the Japanese. The pink areas were where the Chinese communists had control of the areas north of Shanghai and Yan'an. And then the lighter blue areas were the areas that were controlled by the Chinese nationalists. Now, they were involved in a civil war, but when they were in the United Front, Mao Zedong and the Communist Party, they tended to want to sort of lay back and let the nationalists take the brunt of the combat. I mean, they officially were involved in it, and they did fight battles against the Japanese, but the Nationalist Party ended up doing more of the fighting. They ended up taking more of the beating, having more of their weapons destroyed, so that, of course, in 1949, the Communist Party of China had defeated the Nationalist Party, and in August of 1949 was declared the People's Republic of China by Mao Zedong, which is Communist China today. Much of this was involved came to pass because of the Japanese desire to carve up China and other parts of this area. They considered that they wanted to create an economic prosperity zone. They had slogans like East Asia for the East Asians, although everyone else in the world interpreted that as East Asian for the Japanese. Because in Korea, for instance, they were using Korea not only for laborers, for conscript army soldiers to fight in the battles, but also thousands of comfort women who basically were sexual slaves to the Japanese military were brought out of Korea, and even a vast majority of the food was taken out. They estimate that during the period of time that it was colonial period in Korea, controlled by Japan, that the calorie consumption, the rice consumption particularly in Korea, went down by more than a third because the food was being exported to Japan and to Japanese armies elsewhere. So this really had been the cause of it, and as we know, and we talked about this, after 67 cities in Japan had been firebombed and virtually destroyed by conventional firebombing, on August 6th, the bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima. 2 days later, the USSR, having promised the other allies that once Germany was defeated, which they had been in May before this, that within a month after the official surrender of Germany, the USSR, the Soviet Union, Stalin had promised to go to war against the Japanese. They had been at least had a non-aggression treaty prior to that. So the USSR on August 8th declares war on Japan and invades down through Manchuria. The next day, August 9th, the second atomic weapon is dropped on Nagasaki. On August 14th, there is the official, the stated surrender where they played the recording from the Emperor, Emperor Hirohito, saying that they were, as difficult as it was, going to accept the unconditional surrender demands of the Allied powers. And then on September 2nd, there was the formal surrender by Japan aboard the USS Missouri, the battleship, received by the senior commander of the Allied powers, Douglas MacArthur. There were a number of very aggressive efforts by both military and civilian forces in Japan to prevent Japan from surrendering. Senior officers did not want to do it. There was sort of a split. And many of them did not want to surrender because some of it was their modern adaptation of Bushido, the code of the warriors that said that surrender was dishonorable. Some of it had to do with the fact they still had a significant army in China that had, was still available, that they felt that they could call back to the home islands in case of invasion. So there were a lot of reasons, but senior officers tried to resist and then finally gave in. Junior officers attempted a coup. Students attempted a coup. There were a lot of efforts to try to prevent, much of it by saying that the emperor hadn't really, either hadn't really surrendered or agreed to surrender, or else that they had forced him to, and that it wasn't something he really wanted to do. In terms of the Sino-Japanese War, which is really what we're talking about, whether you say it lasted 14 years as the Chinese did, or 8 years, 2 months, and 2 days, which is the usual accounting, there were 35 million people killed and wounded. The vast majority of them were Chinese civilians, 1.1 million Japanese, and more than half the fatalities in the Pacific War were in China, not in the islands as we think about it. I'm going to talk about the Pacific War tomorrow. As I said, in 1949, in August, the Civil War was concluded in China with the victory of the Chinese Communist Party over the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party of Chiang Kai-shek. The Nationalist Party was forced in late 1949 to retreat to Taiwan when the Communist Party took over control of the mainland. And so to this day, we have two Chinas. There is the People's Republic of China here, and then Taiwan, the island with Taipei as the capital, is the Republic of China. Two different Chinas. Of course, Korea is an independent, two independent nations now, North and South Korea, with Japan no longer having control of any of these areas. And that's where we are today. Japan, Korea, South Korea at least, both have had phenomenal economic prosperity in recent years. After all of the devastation of the war, both of them have become major economic powers in the world. Questions about Japan versus China? Yes?
Mongolia there is now part of Russia.
Mongolia technically is an independent country. It's not.
So is Kazakhstan.
Kazakhstan, yes. Kazakhstan, all of these, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, they don't have lines up here, but well, this is, Uzbekistan is down here.
Yeah.
Kazakhstan, I was in Kazakhstan in August. It's an independent country. But obviously there's questions, for instance, the Nepal down here. We've had questions before about Nepal. Why is there so much conflict over Nepal? And somebody asked a question at one point, why is there so much conflict over the little country of I'm sorry, not Nepal, Tibet is what I mean. Why is there so much conflict over the little country of Tibet? Tibet's 1/6 of the land area of China. It's huge, and it has really rich mineral resources. So that tells you why they're having a conflict over it. Yes?
What is then the War of Crimea in 1903 in the Crimean War?
Right.
What is
The Crimean War is over on the Black Sea, which is over here. Crimea is a peninsula that sticks down into the Black Sea. So that was a very, that was part of the First World War efforts where, well, I won't get into the details of that, but that's much further to the west. Other questions about any of this? Yes?
So when Admiral Perry came in and forced Japan to open up after being isolated for so long, no natural resources, basically, where did they get the money to modernize?
Right. It's often a question that gets asked is how did they get to the point where they modernized? Much of it was negotiating with other powers for future benefit. They did have, while they didn't have minerals, they did have various, they had copper, for instance, which is not great if you're trying to make steel, but they had copper that they could trade with. They, as an agrarian country, they did have crops that they could export, rice, for instance, and it was a matter of very slowly. It's like, how does anybody start a business when they got $120 in their pocket? Well, they turn that into $220 and then $500, and this is what Japan did, and they did it in very short order. And much of it was developing relationships with some of the Western powers to negotiate for the availability of weaponry and things of that sort. And then a big part of it, again, their principle, which they had learned from the West, is as soon as we can build our military up enough, we'll take what we need. So that was part of it. Yes?
So it was basically at the end of World War II that I guess the United States particularly decided to return Manchuria and Singapore and various places to China. Who made that decision and what were they getting for it in return? Were they doing some bargaining with China? What happened with that?
Well, all of the Allies were involved in returning the various, bringing freedom to Korea, which had been technically part of Japan, and also Manchuria and the other areas. It's interesting that at the end of the war, we'll be right back.
Well, I had a very good afternoon tonight as well to 3.5 meters after midnight, so it'll be generally increasing throughout the evening, and at its worst sort of in the early hours of the morning. 3 to 3.5 meters is roughly what we experienced on the first night. It's going to be on the beam this time, so probably more rolling than pitching, but a little bit of both. So please do take care as you move around the vessel. Make sure you stow any loose items in your stateroom in your suite before you retire for the night. We should be picking up the pilot at about 7 o'clock in the morning, hoping to be alongside for 8 o'clock in the port of Shimizu. This little burst of bad weather is likely to persist until mid-morning. Tomorrow they're forecasted Shimizu looking sunny in the afternoon, from mid-morning to the afternoon, and getting to be very, very hot again, 26 Celsius, well, very, very hot if you're for England, that is, and looking like a favourable sort of afternoon. So fingers crossed that comes in sooner than expected. In the meantime, do come up on deck if you wish. Enjoy the sail away, provided you can find a patch of shelter. The pilots informed me that we will not be having a band on departure tonight, which is a shame, but I think we've done very well on this cruise so far. And it is pouring with rain. Well, on that note, I wish you all a very pleasant evening on the Starlet.
Well, hopefully the clouds will part some tomorrow because the big feature in Shimizu, of course, is Mount Fuji. So we want to try to be able to see it if we can. To finish answering your question, the end of the First World War, remember I told you that after the Boxer Rebellion, which ended in 1901, there had been a lot of ports that were given to other of the 8 powers that were involved in putting down the Boxer Rebellion, like Qingzhou being German. Well, at the end of the First World War, the Allies, the ones who won, they're saying, well, what shall we do with all of these properties that in China that Germany had controlled, or the Austro-Hungarians had controlled, or whatever? And Japan was saying, give them to us, give them to us. And finally, it occurred to somebody, maybe we should give them back to China, since that's who they belonged to in the first place, and they were taken away from them. And so once that was established, that idea was consistent. After the Second World War, they did the same thing. Manchuria had been historically part of China, and so it was returned to China. And the Allies were very much involved in that. You know, I mean, all of the Allies were. The U.S. had the greatest presence, but all of the Allies were in agreement on that. That the areas that had been taken by Japan were returned to the countries that had originally owned them. Okay. Yes.
My father was in the Navy at the end of the Second World War. He was a couple of years too young to really have fought. He went in like 3 months before the war was over. But once the war was over, he was in China, and what they did all day is ferry Chinese army people who were in North Vietnam. They took them out of Hanoi, up the Yangtze River into Manchuria to
Right.
fight Mao Zedong.
Mm-hmm.
He did that for a year.
Yeah.
But he said they never took anybody home.
Yeah.
They all died.
Yeah. The battle. By that time, by the end of the war, I mean, between 1945 and 1949, it was pretty consistently the Communist Party of China was gaining the upper hand. In fact, it got to be such a lost cause, and Chiang Kai-shek did not do a particularly good job. You know, the economy was just absolutely in tatters. That was one of the biggest reasons why the peasants, the ordinary people, were siding with the communists, is because it was in such bad shape under the nationalists that they were gaining more and more advantage. So by the end of 1949, they controlled the whole mainland. So yes.
Could you comment briefly on the Japanese military from 45 to current time?
Could I comment briefly on the Japanese military from 45 to current time? No.
Okay.
Oh, no, just kidding. The Japanese agreed that they would not build a military, at first at all. Later on, it was agreed that they could build a military, and they do have a military, although no nuclear weapons, as you might imagine, and their armies are kept at a very limited size because of dependence on various allied powers. I mean, the United States, for instance, has an absolute agreement with Japan that if ever they are in need of defense, we will come to their defense. And so that has prevented the Japanese from having to build up more of a military. And they're, you know, the same thing was true with Germany for a very long time. I mean, Germany now has a military, but in both cases, after they lost the wars, they were very limited. And then later on, as they developed relationships and whatnot, then those restrictions were not as necessary. But Japan still has not built up a military anywhere near what they were. When we started the Second World War, as we'll talk about tomorrow, Japan had more ships than all of the other allies together. So they had a significant military force. Thank you all very much, and have a good evening.